So this lecture is going to have a number of it's broken up into a series of different aspects around the idea of topography and around this idea of figured ground. And so figured ground is a notion that comes from Beth Meyer. Somebody who read that, tell me what figured ground is. Figured ground as compared to, for instance, the figured ground diagram. I can see that reading in front of some people. Tell me what figured ground is. Okay, let's step back. Figure, ground, what's the difference? We spent a whole week on it. Object and field. It's the difference between one being something that sits in a field. It's a dynamic of landscape as something that spreads outwards. The urban potentially is something that spreads outwards, and the architectonic object sitting on it. When we talk about figure, we're talking about something that is both the figure as in like figure 5.1.1, which is like it's an object, it's a figure you can refer to, you can see it, it's singular. But also we're referring to figure in terms of the idea of figuration, which is to give something, to make something into a figure. And so, for example, in Gestalt therapy, there's one crucial figure. What is the most identifiable figure in the world? It's the cross. The cross is the ultimate figure. The cross is there's other figures, there's the Star of David, there's the crescent moon, etc. But the cross as a figure, non-religiously even, is one of the most basic figures. Another figure is a circle. It's something we won't see in nature. It demonstrates that it's been made, it's been formed in some way. The more perfect it is, the more abstract it is. And so figuring is a fundamental act of designing. And so the contention around the idea of figure as object and field is that when we make a figure of something, we're creating it an object and we're separating it from landscape. So we're faced with this fundamental conundrum. We're either into the object as a thing sitting in landscape, as a thing that we look at, like my coffee cup, it's an object. We can style it in some way. We can fixate on it. How many of them have we got to sell? We've got 20. They're a figure, they're an object, they're a thing. Our brain works that way. Field, landscape as a condition, moving outwards, indistinct boundaries, arbitrary boundaries. And so that contrast between figure and field, or object and field, is fundamental to the modern relationship of landscape and architecture and society in so many different ways. So when we're talking, and so let's now talk again about the idea of figured ground from Meyer's essay. I've just told you what the difference is between. Tell me what figured ground is. I've got this finger. It's going to start pointing in a second until somebody jumps forward. I can feel it going towards the back. I can feel the finger going towards the back. You're smiling. Come on, tell me. Make an arbitrary jump out there. Come on.
Figured ground would then be like something in the ground, like more in the field paint that's been manipulated by people to become something blurry in between.
Does say. Okay, so that is roughly what we're talking about. It's a contradiction, which is to shape the ground in a figurative way, but in a way by breaking the separation between object and field, figure and ground. So rather than saying, and it's also with a figuring of the ground, in a way it's like an Empire Strikes Back kind of move, or except that where the Empire would be the good guys. Was there one movie about that? Not really, was there? No. It's like the ground strikes back, but the ground is the bad guy. But in this situation, the ground is a good guy. So was there ever a thing like that? I don't know about Star Trek. Anyway, no, Star Wars. Okay, so this is to say that figuring the ground is a way of trying to bring back the landscape as something with form, as something which is not in opposition to architecture. And as we discussed last week, modernism set up landscape as pure, natural, feminine, and architecture as masculine, solid, formed, cultural. And so in a way, setting up landscape as just nature, other, feminine, formless, etc., is a default way of architecture operating. How does landscape seize the idea of design? By setting up the field as something which has a figuration to it. Now, Stanford Quinter, architectural theorist, talks about formation. And so in the movement, in the period that we're going to talk about through this subject, there's been a move away from architecture and design and landscape as form into a movement towards landscape and architecture and design as process. And so in the process of doing that, what's happened is that form is seen to be the outcome of a process as compared to something which is shaped in a kind of artistic, cultural sense. Now, that's only problematic because from my point of view, landscape only got form back like 5 years before it then surrendered it again to process. Because previously to that, when I was a student, most of the time, Ian McHarg's landscape planning was dominating to the point where if you talked about design, everyone basically said, is there some science around that? And if you said, no, it's about design, they would say, well, it's irrelevant. And so form in the 90s gained some renewed interest, and then again, the idea of formalism has returned, and suddenly form is a dirty word. Now, formation, though, is a recognition that form is always about the making and the producing and the process, and you can't separate the figuration, the making of something, the designing of something from the process of making, and it's irrelevant anyway. Now, these are 2 points because they're quite important to this idea of figured ground. So we're making the ground, we're giving it form as we're in the process of making it. And so with that term and elevating the ground, or in a weird way, you don't elevate the ground, but, focusing on the ground is a way of reclaiming a space for landscape. The reason why we try to emphasize topography and topographic manipulation is that rather than reverting to objects and saying that the locus of design is the thing that's above the ground, it's the pavilion, it's the pergola, it's the, as Barcelonan projects did, it's the boardwalk, it's not ever landscape, it's a thing on the landscape. By returning to this, it's a way of saying, no, the whole surface can be articulated. And the logical person to start with this in a category that I'm calling topographic archetypes is actually, now why is it doing this on me? Pardon me. I don't know why I have to do this all the time. Is this guy Larry Halprin. And now you guys have heard about him, you studied him with Clinton last year. So tell me some things about Lawrence Halprin. Guys who did history with Clinton last year. Lawrence Halprin. Start with this little.
To sites, like region.
Yeah.
In the Killer Fountain, which was like mountain, but in a abstracted.
Okay, let's situate him a little bit historically. Anyone know the period we're talking about? Obviously, we're talking about the 60s, right? And so Halprin's really important for this discussion for a number of reasons. Now, one of those reasons is that Halprin was one of the few, he was a real innovator in landscape architecture that was also operating very strongly with architects of his time. And so he was working a lot with Charles Moore. He was working with a range of people in that period and in a very crucial kind of ways. And so Halprin's important because he spans a transition. He's not the first generation of landscape architects educated in the States, which was the people like Ekbo, Kiley and Rose. He's actually in the second generation. He's also at a time where he was able to fuse the environmental interests of landscape architecture with a design interest. And so, for example, if you ever saw any of his work on this project called Sea Ranch, designed by Charles Moore and he developed a really interesting way of analysing landscape, a cultural reading of the landscape and representing the landscape. And then that reading was then used by Moore and Turnbull to design the very famous timber buildings at that point. His partner was Anna Halprin, and she's a very, very famous choreographer of dance. And so she also had a big influence on him because he developed what he called this thing called RSVP cycles. Do you guys remember this at all? And the idea of that was this idea of there being a kind of a sort of formal response to social factors in the landscape. And so the idea was he was actually a lot of the time, and in his projects like this, utilizing the movement of people, the movement of systems, and then sort of like crystallizing it into form to try to work with. He would have said that what he's doing here is actually directing people. He's not, the steps are secondary because they're a tool around the main flow of the site, which is movement of people. And so, in a way, while the water is doing a certain thing, what he's doing is he's moving people. Now, I've put this term in here that I've called topographic archetype, and it's a term that I invented when I was doing my master's, where I was looking at the idea of how do we understand the manipulation of topography. And it relates very strongly to what we'll talk about in the next slide, which is topology. Because a lot of the time I found that that when one is working with topography, one still has to have an object-based mode of thinking to work with topography. Ironically, last year we had, and a lot of you guys will know, Samaya, and Samaya's dissertation was around fashion and working with textiles. Now, I'm not sure that she did it in the kind of way that it could have been done, but in a way working with the surface of a textile where you can ripple it and shape it as a single continuous entity and push it and move it is actually a kind of mode that's not object-based that might allow you to manipulate topography. Whereas the archetype is based on the idea that we have certain ideas in our heads about things like ridges, mountains, valleys, and these are dynamic relationships between high points and low points, and a lot of the time we'll manipulate landscape surface around those kind of things. And in fact, as you might remember in these readings, if anyone had bloody read them apart from Alex, did anyone else read these readings by Stan Allen? Okay, a few nodders, good. He's very interested in this idea, and he talks about the metaphors for landscape around things in the city, like the space between buildings as a chasm. So again, it's a geological or topographical analogy that's utilised to describe the city. And so this is something that also for example, in urban design, which we'll be exploring, is that idea of treating the city as a geology. Now, Halprin, this project, and so the archetype is the working between them, and I think Halprin, as Philippe said, was the idea of the mountain river and waterfall was the fundamental basis upon which Halprin developed his series of fountains in Portland. So this one is the Lovejoy Fountain, and it's probably one of the most dramatic of those fountains. And so, and I mentioned Halprin's kind of scripts, choreographic scripts, and so these are the kind of scripts that Halprin utilised as ways that he brought with him from his wife's practice of choreography to begin to design these kind of spaces around flows. So he's working with flows of people and flows of water. So obviously, where there's a fine line here, and this is an interesting thing because, to some extent, the sad part about people doing stuff like this is we never get to be that naive again. And so what's great about Halprin is that he was able to straddle the line between naturalism and mimicry in a way that did not seem to be corny. So on the one hand, you've got the effects so in a way he's treating these sort of effects or these sort of configurations in a way as rocks that affect the movement of water. And from the lessons of how water moves, he's able to abstract those into these kind of configurations that create a similar effect without directly mimicking the waterfall enough that you can say, yes, I could probably see the relationship, but if you didn't actually know about the relationship, you would still take it on its own terms. But if you said to me in studio, I'm going to mimic a mountain range, I would always be interested in that line of how mimicked it was, what you learnt from it, how you learnt from it. And the more you made it look like a mountain range, the more I'd be worried. But the more of the way you made it act like a mountain range, made the effect of it mountain range-like. Perhaps it created microclimate. Perhaps it allowed for views from above to below. Perhaps it produced a certain sort of wall. These are the lines that we're always walking as design critics about trying to say, let's not just make a mountain unless we're making it deliberately a very kitsch project about make a model of Table Mountain in miniature or something, which we also hopefully won't be doing. But nonetheless, you get what I'm talking about. Now, so here we see, this is really interesting to me. So here's the fountain, and there's these ladies in their umbrellas. And of course, that tells you an awful lot about Portland. And so, you know, it rains up there. It's the Pacific Northwest. And so it's quite an amazing place. But interestingly, this is what that fountain looks like when I visited it. And so I did a trip across the US and then drove from Seattle down to LA. Along the coast there, and I stopped off and looked at as much Halprin as I could look at, and you can see here that, what is it? It's a switched off fountain. What is any fountain that's older than 5 years? It's a switched off fountain. There's, you know, fountains are something that, you know, regardless of whether you have water or not, you know, I really recommend you don't build a fountain in a project. I really recommend you don't do it. Unless you're like the Italians working in, you know, in the villas where it's all hydraulic and you couldn't stop the fountain if you wanted to. I recommend if there's any mechanisation and hard stuff, don't do it. Because in my career, I've done a number of fountains and every one of them got filled in, turned off. Yeah. Yeah, so that's that spot just there. And so, you know, obviously it turns into a totally different sort of landscape when it hasn't got any water coming down it. But I only have seen one fountain. And so of all of the fountains that they did, there's only one of the fountains that's still working. And that's the Keller fountain, which is this one here. And that's because, in a way, it's got such a simple sort of effect. There's also other issues that we'll talk about with Halprin, which is, you know, he's in a world prior to safety. You know, it's much like South Africa, actually. And so, you know, there's a kind of thing here where you can put someone in harm's way in a situation where they could walk along there and fall off, and that would be okay. Whereas, for example, at least in Australia and the US, you can no longer do things like that. So a lot of these fountains, these spaces, when they no longer have fountains in them, they stop being meaningful spaces, because what you do in them without a fountain is sort of, those spaces don't work. Perhaps another option would be to treat these things as seat steps, etc. And then maybe, you know, you can see they've got skater controls here. Perhaps the other way of doing it is it's a skate bowl unless it's got water in it, which is interesting because a friend of mine runs a skate company called Locus in Australia, and they're working on a skate bowl at the moment. This is an aside, a complete aside, where they've asked him to put a fire escape in the bowl, and he was like, "How are you going to get a fire in the bowl?" He's like, "But what if the fire people turn up and they get in there and they can't get out again because they're not skaters?" So he's had to design this world first sort of built-in feature that he's in the process of patenting before he actually installs it, because he reckons that once somebody works out this, because Australia's so excited about risk, once somebody's got one of them, everyone's going to want one, and he's going to make his fortune on fire access for non-existent fire threats and skate bowls. But another one could then be getting out of a skate bowl that turned into a swimming pool. Of course, the original skate bowls in California were swimming pools, you know. And so if we so that's the archetype of the waterfall. Another one is this one. And so, you know, here we can see Larry talking to the older types in planning in Portland about this fountain. I mean, you know, like, you know, Larry was a big acid taker. This was the 60s, you know, you can tell. And so, you know, here is the Ira fountain. And obviously, and what's interesting about it, I think, is when you visit it, you know, you're always used to seeing this kind of view of the fountain. And if we're talking about effects, we can see that the thing about a waterfall is that it's a dynamic between erosion and the underlying geological structure. And so you get it, the surface of the waterfall and the way the water works will always be around the water finding its easiest way down, etc. And so here, you know, he's setting up first a sort of false extruded geology, and then after that, the water's coming down through it. Now, it's quite interesting also because you don't really realise that behind this thing here is actually a park. And so this is sort of like the street edge elevation of this park that's sort of behind it, you know. And so there is there is the kind of the edge of that fountain. So that's acting as the handrail, and then behind it, it sort of sits in the park. Now, obviously, you know, it's the key interest of the moment, but in a way, it's more about the streetscape relationship than about this park. And so I think that they don't talk about that, but I found, when I visited it, I found that to be one of the most interesting things about it. Now, we'll be looking at other Halprin projects, but also things like that the water for the whole waterfall starts actually at these kind of weirs that are built into the park. And so the park actually has this sort of water points running through it, and then they end up falling down at those lower points down there. So it's quite beautiful. Now, it's an archetype because of the fact that it's an archetype based on the waterfall. And so I think the obvious source to look at figures in the landscape is from these topographic archetypes. Now, in the 80s and 90s, we started to see the emergence of what's, postmodernism, and essentially the whole subject is after postmodernism or during postmodernism. Even though I've put this in earlier because I think you can't talk about this topic without talking about Halprin. One of the other people who some of you would have been introduced to is also Lawrence Hargraves. And so maybe you can tell the architects a little bit about Lawrence Hargraves. George Hargraves, pardon me. Tell them about George Hargraves. No. Okay, George Hargraves was if we look at these lineages in landscape architect, he was the kind of generation after Halprin, and was really involved in this topographic kind of movement, you'd have to say. And this project here is was the park for the Lisbon Expo in 1998. And if you want to go and sort of get a freeze frame about what design and landscape and architecture is like whenever you're in a city, go to the Expo, because it's always, regardless, like I've been to expos in Prague from 1940 and stuff, and you get a really interesting sense of what design was about in that moment, because in the Expo, everyone wants to build what's most current at that moment of time. And so there was a real fascination in this period with landscape, and in the period we'll be talking about around landscape urbanism, it builds from this. So here we have, it's a topographic archetype, and what is it mirroring of the kind of topographic dunes? And so dunes become a really major feature in this sort of language of topography and the major topographic archetype from the period of postmodernism. And if we compare the two, we can say in a way modernism is epic, so we have the waterfall, we have the mountain, we have these kind of archetypes. Whereas as we move into the sort of periods of postmodernism, we're moving into process, because ultimately the dune is a formation of meteorology. It's more of a formation of wind, as we know from Cape Town and the Cape Flats. It's more of a formation of wind than it really is a formation of anything else. And so the dune is ultimately a diagram of wind forces, except in the situation here where, and this is one of my critiques of Hargraves' work, is that it's really treating the dune as an object, even if it's a field of objects, rather than as dune as process, because these dunes had no relationship to the formation in relationship to wind. They were treated purely in terms of sculptural forms. And so if we look at 98, late 90s, early 90s, and postmodernism, this is the period where we're talking about the influence of a strong influence in landscape architecture, of art, of environmental art, land art, etc. And so this was first and foremost seen as a kind of plastic act, as a making of a model of clay and shaping, etc. But one thing it does do, which is kind of interesting, and you can see that both in the pictures and my own photos here, is that in a way, if the circulation movement moves in this direction through here, then what you get that's quite interesting is you get a lot of smaller spaces orientated perpendicularly to the path and circulation network. And so you can see this is in a way a gap that you can move through to get to the water's edge over here. And so these are creating spaces inside landscape. And so out of one piece of landscape, you get a multitude of smaller spaces. Now, this is where you can sort of think about what is the, in an urban sense, what are we interested in providing in an urban landscape to people? One argument could be that when diversity of experience, richness of experience could be quite a worthwhile aim to pursue in an urban landscape. And so in a way, this gains a lot of that. Now, and also in a dense country like dense city like Lisbon, where you might have a few hundred people or potentially 1,000 people turn up for a picnic on a weekend, this also provides a huge amount of privacy where one can have smaller gatherings separated off from other spaces in amongst this system. But at the same time, it does a strange, and it also, you could call, ultimately Hargreaves is kind of the ultimate figured ground person, because as compared to the sort of picturesque idea of the park as grass and trees, where landscape is openness, here you have the opposite situation. Landscape is full. It's a full site. It's not an empty site. It's not about clearing away. It's about packing as much experience and diversity and topographic change as possible in.
Can it not be representative of the process of wind and water together?
Don't forget there's a difference. Yes, erosion is part of that, sure. But in this situation, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, the way it's angled, it looks like the water has deposited things.
Yeah, except, you see, I know, this is where, don't forget, there's a difference between, this is for me a very important difference that I think is good to talk about. There's a difference between representation and performance. So, and it's a key difference. And it's like the difference between, I'm going to go to Kailicha and build a mosaic to represent safety, versus I'm going to put in a whole lot of lights and security guards and XXX to create actual safety. And so this is where I'm personally not interested in representation, because I think it's where I think it's a limited thing. I think it undervalues the role of landscape in terms of what it can offer. So if you, for example, I think I talked to you guys about earlier about this idea of the sandcastle with the stick in the sand. Have I told you this analogy? There's a guy called Roel van Gerwen, who's from a Dutch landscape architecture practice, and he did a lecture at a conference that I put together the proceedings for it, and he called the Mesh Conference in 2000, and he talked about this idea of what he calls a steering process. And he said, on the one hand, you can build a sandcastle out of sand on the beach, and it looks perfect. But straight away, the wind and the water are going to start to wear it down. And effectively, its whole process after this point is going to be kind of devolution or change. The other option is you can stick a stick in the sand, and if you locate the stick in the right way, and you put the right stick, or perhaps a couple of sticks, and you consider the relationship between wind and water, perhaps the sandcastle builds itself on the basis of how you locate those sticks and design those sticks on the basis of the effect that they have. And so, for instance, that might be that if this project had developed as a series of sand fences, and there are projects that we'll talk about this semester that do that, if this project developed as a series of empty site with sand fences and produced mound, then yes, exactly what you're talking about. But if it's just a representation of mound, then what I'm saying is it's a topographic archetype. It's actually just saying it's a source for topography. Now, I don't have a problem with that. It's like we have 1,000 sources. I mean, you can do some collage and come up with a design for something, and if it's a good design, I don't care how you generated it. It's a good design, that's great. If it gave you a novel outcome that made you rethink your design in an unusual way, then I'm really happy with that. But if the rationale of your scheme is it looks like a mountain, then, or it looks like a dune, then that's not enough. I would say, what is the effect? And the effect here, which is interesting, is creation of a whole range of diverse small spaces.
So is that not, could that not be a manipulated version of something that has been created by nature?
Yes, but then it's still a representation, right?
Okay, because it's manipulated.
No, because it's not using the actual natural process, it's just representing the natural process.
No, so what I'm saying is, could it not be that part of that is created by a natural process?
I just know that it's not. Because I know the guys who made it. And so I had dinner with, there's a local landscape architect who's absolutely the most incredible guy who one day, maybe we'll get him here one day. His name's João Nunes, and he's in Lisbon, and he was the local practice landscape architect. He's now one of the top landscape architects in the world from Grow Up. And Lisbon's a place where, travel suggestion, you can fly to Lisbon really, I'm coming back to you, I promise. You can fly to Lisbon really cheaply these days because you can go with TAM, right, via Angola. And so the cheapest way to get to Europe at the moment is to go to Lisbon via Angola. You can get there for you can get there for, I think, for less than 10,000 Rand. I think you can get there for 5,000 or 6,000 or something like that. And so Lisbon is also the place where it's some of the cheapest places to stay in Europe. It's like some of the most awesome food there. John Malkovich lives there and has a club. It's awesome. And so I recommend going to Lisbon. And also, you know, so many great architects, Sousa de Moura, you know, and also there's a real diaspora from the rest of the world in Lisbon in terms of, you know, lots of Brazilian people, lots of Angolan people, etc. Now, your question.
Would you say it's possible, like not in this circumstance, but for you to research nature to the extent that it wouldn't be a representation?
Yes,
okay.
it is.
So it doesn't have to be a natural.
No, and again, I'm not. It's that thing where I'm again, as I said, I'm not. I don't have a problem with using anything to generate design. I'm just interested in what the outcome is. And so when you can only talk about the design on the basis of how it's generated, then for me, you're not talking about what everyone else will experience, which is just the outcome. And if we're not outcome focused in design, we're in a way, we're missing the fact that we're not the audience. The audience comes after us. And so this is where I'm saying, if you have to justify a design saying, listen, it represents X, then I'm like, and? Let's talk about what it is. And so what you're saying is you can use those processes. And what I've described, and I'll talk about further in this semester, as you start to work with something which I would call tolerances and with trends rather than exactnesses. So that, for example, say you do the stick in the sand analogy, then what you're doing is you're actually allowing for a tolerance between your desired outcome and the result of the natural process. The more exact you want to be, the less you'll allow the natural process to play out. And that has an impact on design, because design then becomes around contingency, which is to say you have a contingent series of options built into the design in case this happens, or that happens, or that happens, or that happens. We'll talk in a few minutes about examples of that. And so the next thing, and they're in tension to each other because the topographic archetype is still really working with objects. You know, this here is still a series of objects, even if they merge together. I mean, there's obviously a lot of issues for me with this project, which to do with things like that, you're in the business of trying to maintain these sort of edges, and, it's a lot of issues come up when you try to do this. Like, I've got photos that I'll show you in a few minutes about how you go about mowing something like this. As a person who spent a lot of time on this, to me. Later on, he went on to something which he called the fuzzy edge, which relates to this thing, which is the edge that's not exact, but the edge that's blurry, and that we need to work in with blurry edges. Obviously, what's also interesting is that in the dynamic of this project, working from the expo site at one end, right the way through into Buchanan Park, there's a kind of interesting thing where the sort of language of it starts to differentiate. It starts off in a kind of urban configuration, and here he substitutes in sort of skate elements into it until it becomes a sort of surface act, and it gets more and more dramatic. Now, in a hot place like Lisbon, creating, there's really strong reasons for doing this also here. And one of the things that I really encourage people to think about is what I would call micro-topographies, which is, if we're worried about water, how we utilize topography in relationship to wind, evaporation, sun, shade. Topography can have a huge impact. And so, for example, one of my students, you guys might remember Gabby. You'll remember Gabby. Some of you may not. Gabby's project in Windhoek was focused on the idea of utilizing rocks to create shade to allow for dew to be captured, and then planting trees inside mounds of rocks to allow for the rocks to provide microclimate for the trees to come through. And so micro-topographies, or utilising topography like this, even if it might be representational, can still have good environmental effects. Also, if you imagine wind in this situation, and wind coming across the top, if you have a mound like this on either side, the trees in the middle will be able to get taller because their top surface is being set by the edge of the mound and the vegetation growing on it. And so it can still have a really strong catalytic effect. And in that hot place like that, this sort of shade in the middle here is like, that's fantastic. My only criticism of the project was that the main circulation routes didn't have any shade, but that's something. So the topological is a contrast between the two, because while there was a kind of architectural aspect to the archetype as an object, the next thing that happened in that period, in the postmodern period, as a kind of late postmodern period, was around the topological, and it was tied very much to computers. And so I'm first of all going to explain the topological around one project, which is a one-liner, but it's kind of, it slightly descends, that sort of goes over it, but it's a kind of interesting project, and it's in Berlin, in the kind of redeveloped part of Berlin. And the easiest way to describe this project is to say you get a piece of paper like this and you twist it like this. And so it's topological because it's based around a movement on a surface that's totally abstract. In a sense, the dune was still based around a natural paradigm of the dune, even if it's representational, the mountain or the such and such. But in this sense, ground has become totally abstract. And so this, if you can see it, you can see how one end here is twisted up and the other one is pressed down, and the other end is the opposite. And so it's a digital thing because once, this is a super easy thing, like we could model it, I could model it in 2 seconds right now, and we could then produce this entire park quite quickly because we simply get the path in section of one side, we get the same path, put it in the other, so invert it like that, and then we take a Boolean slice right through the center to cut a hole in the center. And that's what this is here. So in the center of it, it's got this cut in the middle, and then it's got, which are pretty awesome actually, these incredibly long seesaws in the center here. And I mean, this is something which is interesting and happening more and more in projects, and I think is really great, which is around, happened more in the last 10 years, but adult play is getting to be a really, like, why do we have play that is only for children? Why can't, who doesn't like to play, And so these are quite incredibly beautifully balanced. And so this thing is a one-liner, and it's really taking up space. But if we think about this idea of the landscape as figure, which is to say previously it was the landscape as endless grass and trees and the figure of the building coming out of it. Here the landscape's come forward, it's twisting, it's topographic, etc. And so one of the things that I found really interesting about it was, and I happened to be lucky enough to see this happen. And so here is how this is mown. There's a guy with a rope, with a mower, and he's dragging this up and down the slope to mow it, right? And I love this stuff because it's like you can't, there's nowhere to hide when you see this sort of stuff. And here's how we try to get, here's to get up, to give this person who's doing this job the ability to get up there. Here's the steps that they built into the side. And to try to maintain a sharp edge, here's how they maintained a sharp edge. They built in reinforcing on the corner as a kind of frame inside which plants would grow to allow for the sharp edge. But you can see straight away, here's what, you still get that kind of wear. And so what you're seeing there is the relationship between the fact that form is affected by processes in the landscape that are conspiring through entropy to constantly turn it into something else. So we go back to the stick in the sand analogy and we say, let's not fight. Let's use those processes. That's where the idea of the stick in the sand comes from. And so, but I think it's an interesting thing because all of the time, there's so many projects are like this where you've got an ambition of landscape form that is constantly fighting against the material degradation that is the basis of landscape. So the reason why it's such a nice topological example is because of that. It's not actually the place that I would start if I talked about this, but it's the place to explain clearly that idea of a topological surface. And probably the most famous project that is like this, and certainly when I was a student, it was the project that I was most excited about. Was finished in 2002, but started in about 1993 or 94 by Foreign Office architects, which is Alejandro Zeropolo and what's her name? Man, I can't believe I've forgotten her name. He's much more Farshid Mousavi. He actually his career has died since he plagiarized one of his own students when he was at Princeton. But this project here, as you can see, was a kind of like, even though it's low res, that was literally still the res of that drawing from the day. was a really entirely a digitally developed thing in 3D Studio Max, and it's for a ferry terminal. And so even though it looks like it's a kind of, it's the reason I wouldn't call it an archetype is that it's actually entirely generated from a series of forces in diagram in 3 dimensions. And so if we look at this drawing here, what you can see, and this is from when I visited it, was you can see how there are all of these routes in and out of this thing. There's the escalators moving up and down. And so the way that the surface of it on the top occurs is on the basis of how the interior of it and its circulation pushes onto the surface. And so as an escalator comes up to the top surface of the roof bulges to accommodate where that comes up. So the surface is the result of the diagram of the internal circulation of the building. And so, and also, obviously it's all about accessing the boats. And so, the first point that you can see here is the kind of main way into it. And so this is the kind of the sort of facade of the building. And I found that probably the most interesting thing on visiting the project, obviously, I'd seen the project, I'd been looking at the project in these kind of representations the whole time. And when I saw it, what I found really interesting was that there's this normalizing process that happens in landscape. Landscape, because it's often non-uniform and non-rectilinear, you can have these situations where, and it's also ostensibly the natural landscape is not designed around people. People and other organisms occupy the landscape. When you start to move into these sort of other processes, you develop things that are uncomfortable to occupation. And so I found the fact that they had to completely cover the entire thing in handrails left, right and centre, and the mitigation. They created a surface only to have to mitigate that surface out of existence because they created so many problems for themselves in terms of safety and the use of the site that even though the design ambition was exciting, you were constantly in the situation where the whole idea of the project was that you can move across the surface. And a lot of projects from this period were around the idea of a flexible surface, multi-use, that an element could be a seat and be a table and could be something else, or that a surface, people could clamber and move around surfaces. But what you see straight away is we have to fence it at the top, we have to fence it at the bottom. We're constantly in the process of dealing with the implications, both safety-wise, use-wise, maintenance-wise, mowing-wise, of this process. And I find that interesting because those are also just other sorts of forces. They're no different from the kind of forces of growth or the forces of erosion or wind. Human forces of maintenance, laws, codes, and this is something that Alan talks about, are no different. Ultimately, another project that's really important from this period of the kind of topological was this project by Carlos Ferreter and OAB architects and Bet Figueras, who has sadly passed away. Bet Figueras, who I was lucky enough to spend some time with, is an extraordinary landscape architect from Barcelona and one of the first to really develop a significant career out of the Barcelona work. And this whole project arose from some of the earliest generations of CAD work. And so here, this is literally the topological mesh. And so obviously you have under what's used to be known as DTMs, digital terrain meshes, you have in surface descriptions, you really have two modes. You have a square mode or a triangular mode, but even when you've got a square tile mode, you've still got a triangular mode. So this is a triangulated surface condition. And then the project itself was a sort of an organisation of a sort of botanic garden of Mediterranean plants. So obviously there's I went there before I knew that I was going to end up before I knew that I was going to end up in South Africa. But obviously, I think I've even got photos of some South African plants. But the whole landscape is entirely developed around these Mediterranean biomes. And so Australia is in there, Canary Islands is in there, the Mediterranean is in there, the US is in there, etc. And the whole landscape itself, when you look at it, is faceted in a way that is not super different from that process. So in a way, it was a placing of that mesh, which was a representation of surface onto the surface. Yeah.
With the previous example, how do you sort of combat the safety concerns of local authority when it comes to manipulating the sort of trafficable surface to that degree?
I'll show you in a second, because there's another project of theirs that came later where they dealt with that. So I will show you, because it is really important. And so here you can see how what they've done is they've got that sort of, this is both a generator, so it's like an existing topography that's been turned into a mesh, and then a representation of itself is put back onto itself. It's like someone taking a photo of you and putting a photo of you back on yourself. It's that sort of a weird sort of space to move into. And then what happens is certain segments of that are flattened out. And so you can see here how the circulation takes in the mesh line, but then when you get to these other areas, they're really where the mesh outline is kept, but then the surface is just like horizontalized, and then you have this sort of Corten walls all around the place. Now I think that must be Australia, because those are grass trees. That must be the Canary Islands over there. Let's see if we can find South Africa in here somewhere. Would that be South Africa? Yes. Aloe-ferox, that's South Africa. And so, it's amazing botanic gardens and well worth a visit. And so, going to your question, this is another project in Barcelona by Foreign Office architects from 2004. And interestingly, in this situation, we could have a whole other conversation about this area that's known as the Forum, which is what I would call a project zoo. There's a big thing in international projects where having a branded piece of architecture in your city, like Thomas Heatherwick doing Zeitz Mocha, is a big draw card, like Sydney having the Opera House, like Bilbao having the museum. And so I call this project zooing, because people basically create an area, redevelopment area, and say, yeah, let's get Jean Nouvel in, and yeah, let's get someone else in, and it becomes because they didn't like the uniformity of modernism, and it's completely uniform urbanism in terms of its master planning. Here they have an approach of, we'll develop a master plan, and then we'll give every plot to someone else, and Bjarke Engels can have that bit, and they can have that bit, and it comes together looking like a zoo of strange stuff. This project is very much like that. So you have this weird thing where one bit of project intersects with another bit of project this one is done by Beth Garley, and this one is done by Jean Nouvel, and this one is done by someone else. But this is the Foreign Office architects bit. And to answer your question here, what you can see is that they've utilised the wall here to do it for them, in a way. So it becomes so steep and so uniform that it's actually not really climbable in an easy way. You could put your hands up there and haul yourself up there, but then there's sort of plants right on the top, and so they're utilising the steepness and the curve of that surface to do it for them. We've compared that to say where are we? This here, you can see that this is a kind of scramblable. We could kind of potentially scramble up that, but when we get to these kind of surfaces, not so easy to do. And so again, this one is sort of like a miniature. This is a bit more like a topographic figure, because this is a kind of miniature sort of valley, and it's really just a series of ramps at different levels, where the transitions between the ramps utilize different sorts of surface treatments, where sometimes the treatment is made of the same paver, which becomes at some points a wall and some points a surface. Sometimes it's vegetated. And you can see here also this thing where the grasses are self-seeding into the paving. And so this is also a movement. If you can think of the High Line having these sort of fingers of masonry where plants grow between them, there is this thing happening in hard landscape detailing and urban detailing around how to accommodate change in materials that don't change. And a lot of that is around leaving gaps for ecologies to develop in the gaps between things, for example. How many more have I got here? So the next one is really figured ground in the sense of the way that I would use it and the way I think that Maya would use it. And so it's an interesting way to use it because figured ground for me is not about simply trying to copy an object into the ground plane or to make the ground plane into a visible object. It's about utilising the shaping of the ground to organise activity and to shape spaces. And for me, it's what a lot of landscape architecture has been doing for a long time. This project here is a very famous project by Hargraves in association with a number of artists called Bixby Park. And probably this is one of the first projects where landscape architects began collaborating strongly with artists. And so essentially each one of these parts is a different collaborative project with a different conceptual artist. And so here we can see, this in a way is interesting because these are topographic objects. These are not dissimilar to putting on dunes on top of a landscape, but in a way the landscape is actually organised by the bigger topographic moves, and then these things articulate it. So this is more like a kind of like a way of dealing with the sort of top of the ridge and the top of the hill. This here is an artwork that is dealing with the transition between one space and another, etc. And so when Hargraves talks about, which he was at that time, he was talking about this thing he called the fuzzy edge. What he's really talking about is landscapes where they can metamorphosize and change, and landscapes which are not about creating edges and demarcating the edges of processes. And so, as we'll talk about in a second, every time we create a fixed edge, we create something against which change will look wrong. And so essentially we create an edge, then we have to cut back to it. You create an edge, the plants grow over it. Oops, the plants have demarcated the edge. You create an edge, informal settlement crosses it. Or you create an edge, informal settlement can't cross it. We'll keep creating edges, we'll keep demarcating. It's in zones where there are no edges that change occurs. This is not a kind of just a metaphorical thing. If we're interested in sustainability, if we're interested in any natural process relationship, we have to start to look at how we deal with edges in technical terms. Because every time you create an edge, you're creating something which will intersect with a natural process. Essentially, a pipe is an edge treatment. If we imagine the fact that we want to work with water, what we're really probably going to have to do is start to work with fluid edges. So as soon as we start to work with fluid edges, we're having problems with the intersection between fluid edges and property boundaries. I want to fix this water situation. I want the council to fix this water situation, but they have to fix it on their own land because my land is private land. How do we get people to do things on their land? We steal land from them, or we buy the land from them, or we put policies on top of them. So land tenure, edge creation is tied fundamentally to capitalism. Landscape systems are completely uninterested in capitalism. And so this is for me an interesting, I'm not a massive fan of capitalism, but we live in it and I like my books. And so nonetheless, we're facing a point where the amount of available space for flexibility of natural process is getting smaller and smaller. The requirement for that land to be flexible is increasing, and we're going to get to points where we're going to have some funny conflicts arise. And so this idea of fuzziness is really important. Now, another key project for me that you might not be aware of, but I put in here because it's, awesome, is by this guy called A. Bai. A. Bai is a landscape architect who did a lot of work on private gardens. And so one of the most famous ones was this project called Gainesway Farm in Kentucky. And it's really like a farm that is just being graded and manipulated. in a very gentle sort of way. And I always think that this here is a really nice example of this thing that I was talking to you before about utilising topography to create microclimate. And so here we can see how elevation is potentially causing the differences. Effectively you've got frost hollows. And so what's happening is that through the manipulation, a whole lot of frost hollows are being created. And so that's a way of figuring the snow by utilising topography to affect meteorology. Those are the kind of sequences that I think are really interesting. Ideally in our landscape systems and our constructing landscape system subjects, I would like us to move more into the point where we start to consider how we can utilise these type of movements of topography to work with meteorology to create landscape effects like this. But in terms of the idea of the figured ground, we come back to landscape architecture because ultimately landscape architecture for a long time has been utilising topography to structure what it does. Landscape is big. Topography is something that is really operates around something with people that I call experiential catchment. It's a really simple idea, which is that we are anywhere between 1 point something and 1 point something high, and anything that's above our eye height is spatially and experientially separated from us. So every time we create an angle or surface that has some elevation to it, we're separating space A from space B. Every time we lower it to eye level, we create a horizon. Every time we create for instance, we separate two things in space, we create a distance where we might lose sight of something. Every time we bring it closer, we're like zooming in. And so this relationship between the circulation system of landscape, of paths, of roads, etc., and the way that it's spaced in relationship to topography in 2D and 3D affects a lot about how we understand space. And so this project's a reasonably simple idea. It's one of my favourite projects by this guy, Gustav Lange. It's along a site of the old Berlin Wall, and I got to visit it in 93. Obviously the wall came down in 88 or 89. And so, was it 89? I think so. And so it's within 5 years that I first visited the project. And it's quite interesting because they kept a few stretches of the wall here. Now already you can see that stuff was getting built in. And so one of the problems with memory, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about South Africa, and interesting about the ANC's policy around memorials, was, I always found it interesting when I first came here, why would the ANC suggest let's not delete the road statue? Why would they argue for keeping it? Why would they argue for keeping the Voortrekker monument? Why would people do any of those things? And it's because memory as a public act has to have something to be remembered against in relationship to. And one of the biggest problems in Berlin has been that the wall has been removed to the point where they've had to really force themselves to keep bits of it. And if you do a walking tour of the wall, the line of the old wall in Berlin, you can't really find it. It's almost gone now. And so, I think it's really mature in a way of South Africa to say we need the things that remind us also of our unhappy past so that we can remember that they occurred. And so this project is based around this wall and the sort of dimensions of no man's land. And it's simple. It's got one long path, and then it's got one bank on one side of it, and then it's got one flat area. So it's a simple diagram: path, bank, and then flat area. And at the top of the bank, you have this situation where you have these bits of leftover wall which have been left to be vandalized, and you also have these fantastic kind of adult sort of swings again, where you can sort of you can swing out over this bank, and so you get a little bit of that jittery feeling in your stomach as you swing out, because you sort of swing out over an edge, and then you can sort of look out over Berlin. And the top of this landscape, as you can see, it's been vandalized and painted in a massive sort of way. And Gustav Lange, who's a sort of under-recognised but fantastic landscape architect, the council came up to him and said, where your site is being ripped to pieces. And he said, no, my site is just growing up and it's loved. And this is the way that people express their love of my site, is by utilising it. And I don't think that it should be over-controlled, because it's been designed around the idea that people can find a place in the landscape to do what they want. And so, if you go to Berlin, or if you get onto, or used to be able to, I haven't done much research around it, but you used to be able to find out who was painting where on this. International graffiti artist would paint on it, and it was constantly having stuff going on. And you can see this is the bank that's got the transition down to this lower level. And so what's happening on the lower level is it's very wide, there's huge amounts of light, it's the main thoroughfare through the site, and so if you're worried about security, you walk along that path, and there's lots of people on that path, and you find your own location. So this is potentially a bit like the Badlands up here, but it's actually, you can kind of position yourself in terms of your own idea around safety in that landscape. And so, on the top here is where, people will be dealing hash, and they'll be having graffiti happening, and there'll be, stuff happening over here. On the big flat area, there's a permanent camp of punks and their dogs playing soccer down here. And then along the centre here is where families are kind of hanging out and moving through. And along that line that I've been showing you are a series of these different sort of insertions into the bank, or different sort of micro-topographies. So here are these two sort of bosques of lowered sort of landscape. There's a basketball court, there's a sort of like an amphitheatre, and so it's all around sort of tying things onto this long line. And if you look at the topography of it, it's quite a kind of nice way of grading it, because there's a sort of like, you enter, when you enter, you've got this kind of like these sort of steps up, and all the way along there are these small adjustments into those two spaces. And so here is this other space is slightly elevated, and then there are these kind of ramps to move into it. Here is one of these slightly depressed areas where they're playing pool at certain points. Other points they've sort of got something that's almost like an amphitheatre, going on along the top here. And so basketball court over here. And so for me, really interesting landscape architecture is where people play around with both small tolerances of that 100 mils matters, that 50 mils matters, that you articulate space with small changes and small edges like this, right through to bigger moves and how you colonize and work between those. Now you can see how the material condition of this has changed. And one of the things that happened in Berlin is something that essentially has happened in Cape Town, but we just haven't got enough water to worry about it, is that maintenance, there's too much open space. East Berlin, West Berlin joined up, too much open space, no ability to maintain anything. And so effectively the parks are being just let go completely. And in this situation, the only reason why this is not overgrown with regenerating birch, etc., is it's so heavily utilised by people that the people are controlling the grass and they're controlling the trees on the site. And so it's self-regulating in relationship to that. Hang on a second, did I see something buried in here? Oh no, it's those houses there. And so it's also, by the way, got quite a large stadium sort of built into it here, which is acting as a kind of, it's the sort of bank for it. And so another project, which is probably also for me, one of the ultimate of these sort of projects around figuring the ground, where if you understand what I mean by figuring the ground, it's like how you're shaping the ground to create spaces and to create and demarcate uses to lead things through. So it's not necessarily, figured ground for me is not necessarily about creating crazy surfaces for their own sake where you feature the ground or mounds like this. It's rather about how you manipulate the topography in finer ways. This project here, Parc Departemental Associate by Atelier Corrigou, is also a fantastic project in how this operates with And I've always used this as a way to explain scale in landscape. You know, this is a really massive piece of parkland near the airport in Paris. And there's a nice kind of move that happens here where you can sort of see here, there's this mound along the top here where which is where I'm sort of looking at and I'm going to explore. And it's the top of a ridge, essentially. It's, if you can see, it's along the top here. And so this topography has been created where there's a ramp at the back, then there's a lift up to this edge of this mound, then there's a set of steps down, and then there's this lower level. Now, landscapes are big enough that when you're working on the top areas, I think you can see it in this drawing, this panorama better, is that mound is actually creating a space behind it, because topographically, if you're walking here, your head height is about here, and so you can't kind of look over it, so it's sort of separating a space that's addressing in this direction, but it's actually built in section. It's like the section goes up, down, along, and then there's a bigger space on that side. And then it creates a kind of threshold that you move through to then emerge into this space through here. And so it utilizes this relationship of height to landscape to create openings and closing, spaces behind, spaces in front. And if you were going to grade this in terms of design, you would have add a 1:1,000 scale, or you would have then created a larger surface of this bowl shape. And as you move down in scale, you might have then created this subsidiary space behind the mound at a scale of maybe 1:200, and then you might have moved down to a site scale where you might have graded this in at a scale of 1:50 or 1:20. So this gives you a sense of how scale in landscape and topography can change. Let's have a break for a second and then we'll come back. Let's just call it 5 minutes. How do you, in WhatsApp, how do you select a whole lot of things to forward? Do you just, do you have to do them in order? Like if
No.
no you don't.
No.
They'll find their own order.
Yeah, I think so. Send them in chronological order.
Okay, great, thanks.
Theoretically.
Sorry?
Theoretically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Well done. Have you organised a campsite?
Sure. This AB. We've got 30. It's pretty crazy.
That's right.
We've got 30 at the moment.
30 in your campsite.
A lot of pancakes.
We've got about 22.
Me too.
Hopefully, because the people said they're coming. Only 10 people have bought their tickets.
Only what?
Only 10 has bought their tickets.
Did you? How many direct distribution tickets did you actually send out?
Well, over 4 artist tickets.
Yeah.
8 full price
Yeah.
DVDs, but I just released them.
Did you? Into the pool? Yeah. Okay, so maybe if we sit down and we'll get going again. So, if we, I think my thing is that this has been going the whole time. It's been recording the whole time since the gap.
Now you know everything.
Does anybody even listen to it? So it makes no difference. Occasionally you look at their views and you think, who are those people? But I'm sure I could find an app to trace them. But Halprin is obviously also, I think it's always interesting when you visit places and you get a chance to see things in context. And so for me, one of the things like that was when I visited Lisbon after having visited Rio. I realised, okay, well, Bill Marx's stuff is not that radical because it actually fits within a strong Portuguese thing. And probably if I visited Mozambique and Angola, I would probably find a similar thing. And it's true also with Seattle. When you start to go to the Pacific Northwest, you realise there's a kind of cultural basis for what's happening. And so probably after these fountains, if we go north into Seattle from Portland, Seattle is this project is probably the most famous project of Halprin's, and it's called the Seattle Freeway Park. Now, I mean, when I was a student, when I first started studying, this was the project that was like my ultimate, I thought it was the most incredible project ever. And so what's really exciting about it also is that, when you see a drawing like this, which came from Halprin's office, you realise that sometimes whole projects can come from something really small, like some people talking to some people, doing a drawing of something. And I remember working in an office with, it was quite recently actually, about 5 or 6 years ago, with this guy called Timothy Hill, and he said to me, you have to make a drawing of it. You have to make everything. He always say you have to make a drawing of it, because you can't make a drawing of it. You have no ability to explain it to somebody, and you have no ability to influence it. So it's always like, make a drawing of that, make a drawing of that, even if you couldn't even think about how to make a drawing. And so one of the things you can get online is like a faxed hand-drawn series of things that Halprin put together to make a bid for this as an idea, which just ended up on the right person's desk, and then out of it ended up happening. And so essentially a freeway was built in Seattle, and that freeway... No, you're not from that part of the world. You're down south, aren't you? You're further south. But no. Have you been to Seattle?
Yeah.
Okay. And so...
Sorry, I'm from the northeast.
Northeast. Uh-oh. Whereabouts in the northeast again? Philadelphia. Okay.
Yeah.
But you'll then know how long a drive is to go from the northeast to the northwest, which I did.
Yes.
That is a monster. That is a monster of a boring drive, that one. But and so Seattle Freeway Park is obviously a cut and cover essentially park. And so this was built first, and then it was effectively cutting the city in half. And so the park was built as a way to try to join the city back together, and it does that. I can't say it's always in the best part of town for this, and it's also a little bit dodgy these days. But one thing, if you look at that drawing, you can see how it's about kind of stitching it together out of lots of small bits, and so it's quite strategic in how it does that. Yet again, Halprin designed it in such a way that it's around mimicking a kind of mountain situation. I think it's interesting to look at it on the side there to see it's also built into Art Centre and other sort of complexes. And when you see this, you need to realise that this is a period that's become known in architecture, became known in that period as Brutalism, after a book that was written by Rainer Banham called The New Brutalism, where he brought together a whole lot of projects, and all across the world projects like this were built at this time. And if you look at the Civic Centre and its relationship to the what's the name of the Performing Arts Centre? Artscape. You can see that's the kind of approach that was happening at that time. And so, and internationally, you could probably go to every city in the world and you'll find examples of this. And I hate to say very few of them working, because a lot of the time they create spaces, well, the spaces they create under often are terrible. And then the spaces they create on top are highly synthetic. You also need to see this in the context of projects like there was in the Oakland Museum by Dan Kiley, where a lot of these projects are also, they're operating around creating of planters for trees, etc. And this is one of the most successful in terms of growing trees. Obviously, it's all about soil depth in that sense. Now, when you go there, the most famous pictures of it all look like this, of course, So it's people clambering all over it and waterfalls like this, and so it was an incredible space, except until, I can't remember the date, but somebody did actually fall off and die in this fountain, and after that point it never had water again. It was kind of closed off in various ways. You can still kind of clamber around it a little bit, but it's very carefully organised now. And in a way, the landscape of it, I think you can see the relationship between it and the Keller Fountain, etc. The artificiality of the difference is that even though this is an artificial ground, it straddles quite interestingly the line between an artificial ground and a natural landscape. And if we talk about that, the last project I'll show is a kind of example where it's trying to mimic a natural natural landscape, whereas here this is quite clearly not trying to be a natural landscape. It is again trying to be sort of influenced by lessons learnt from a natural landscape. You can also see some of the sort of features that are sort of if we look at, again, this sort of edge you see now in projects where there's an attempt to try to blur edges, we can see that in the 70s and the 60s, this is something that was also happening in an attempt to try to break down that boundary in some way or blur that boundary between a sort of natural surface and a synthetic kind of surface. And I think probably if we look at the model, you can start to see how there is that water feature, and it is like a canyon. So on the one hand, it's got a surface underneath it. Is that a model or is that a photograph? Looks like a photograph, actually. These model. Are you model people? No, you look like real people. Or you're real people trying to be model people. And so, yeah, you can see how also it's sort of mimicking a little bit. It's got a canyon underneath and it's kind of got a canyon on the top. Another project that's in Seattle that's sort of inspired by this kind of thing is the Olympic Sculpture Park by Vice Manfredi. And on the way from here to there, I moved through a part of town which is quite interesting, which is the fish market in Seattle. And so Seattle's got an interesting thing where it's got a relationship between the water and this sort of surface of the city, where it's sort of got this big embankment that sort of drops down to the water's edge. And this building is like a series of ramps that it's sort of like the building goes down a hillside, and then you walk through these zigzagging ramps through the building down the hillside with shops going onto them. And suddenly it made me sort of realize that the Seattle Freeway Park was actually part of a continuum of sort of natural synthetic projects that were already happening in the city. It's not like it was in itself just this radical kind of thing. Looks like a light fitting. Anyway, and so when you get down to that lower level, you get to the sculpture park. And the site for the sculpture park is similar to the freeway park insofar as that most of the site is infrastructure. And so it's got a railway running through it, it's got roads running through it, it's got level changes, it's actually a relatively small amount of site, whereas it tells you a lot about the difference in period, because in this period the idea was, this is an eyesore, get rid of it. Whereas we're in a period now in design where infrastructure is to some extent celebrated and fetishized. And we'll talk about that because I give a lecture on landscape infrastructure. And so in this situation, you can see how the road goes underneath and the railway goes through. And so rather than those being negative things, in actual fact, they represent a kind of dynamism that the site has. The art gallery itself is over, the sculpture park is sort of over here with odd pieces of sculpture through it. And then the rest, again, is like a ramp, that this ramp goes up, across, and through to there. And so it's a series of ramps that are not dissimilar from these ramps through here. And you start to realize that sometimes the sort of make-arounds that happen in the culture become reinterpreted by designers. And so while this is not strictly an artificial ground, it does a really smart thing around not having much site, but utilizing the site it does have to suggest that there's kind of more surface area than there actually is. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's sort of like, here's one ramp coming up and back. And so even though this is just a space of transition, it's a kind of access way, it's sort of expanded out. And these sort of walls, and there's views and walls and looks down. So you have this dynamic between the site that doesn't really exist and a landscape that's kind of not supposed to be there, and that it makes the most of articulating all of those kind of ground changes to the point where you end up at the bottom. Where are we? Here is the bottom of the site. And so it's sort of deliberately, as you can see, is featuring that transition of this sort of network through here and through the site, and sort of here is a lookout on the top. So it's really deliberately playing with the idea of the site almost not existing. You walk to the top here, and then when you walk to the top here, you find yourself on these kind of ramps that are sort of zigzagging back. So a lot of the time, I think that landscape, in the same way that this project here used the mound as a kind of perpendicular thing, this project that we're looking at here is really utilising the ramp to get more sight out of sight. So it's almost like this site didn't really exist, it sort of made it. If we go to this last example here, it's a completely weird project, which is that it's the Irish Hunger Memorial, and so obviously New York, was founded, a lot of it or emigration was a big part of New York's identity, and obviously there was an Irish potato famine that happened that caused a lot of people to migrate to the US. And I mean, if any people have got any Irish background here, they'll know that the English colonised Ireland, that people had their traditional land rented back to them. They had to pay higher and higher rents to their English landlords. They were essentially only living on potatoes, and then the potatoes obviously we're here, the potato comes from South America. And so we can see that all of the networks of colonisation, plant movement, crops, the Irish wouldn't have been able to feed themselves if it weren't for the fact that the Spanish had already colonised, South America, and then there was a problem with the potato. The potato was wiped out, there was massive famine, lots of deaths and lots of emigration. And so this is a memorial to that. And on the top surface, it's quite weird because it kind of works. Like, again, if any of you sort of came to me with this as a studio project, I would be really dubious of this as a studio project. But so this is a kind of like, it's a simulation of the Irish countryside right there in New York. And so we've got the beautiful walls, and we've got the little cabins and all of this sort of the grassland, etc. But it's extremely well done, And so then, on the one hand, it's got that surface that addresses from one side of it over here, and then underneath it, it has this sort of memorial that cuts through it, that memorializes this thing, and on the underside, it deliberately articulates it. There's me taking photos of defects, which is always a favourite thing of mine to do, where I'm sure this is not supposed to be dripping across this face here. And so on the underside, it's entirely synthetic, but on the top side, it's entirely naturalistic. And so it's a fake, it's a simulation, it's a simulacra, It's a terrible thing in photography on site that you can never choose what life is like. But, and so I think if we look at all of those together for a second, we have this one that's pretending to be nature but not looking like nature on a fake piece of landscape. This one that's then celebrating the artificiality of it and the infrastructure, celebrating all the things that this is trying to mitigate. And this one here, which is on the surface more natural than natural, more island than island, but on the that is celebrating its sort of underside in a way that, for instance, neither of the other projects do. And so this is sort of, if we're talking about artificial ground, it's always sort of like, will the real ground stand up? What's the actual ground here? What's the connection? And I think this is an important question. It's a little bit of an aside, but in cities at the moment, we have to accept the fact that one of the problems is that we are covering more and more of the ground. And the more and more of the ground that we cover, the more and more effects we have on our aquifers. And the more and more we make ourselves potentially exposed to terrible geomorphological problems, so that, for example, in some clay cities in the world, as the ground gets covered and the clay dries out, because there's no water penetrating through endless concrete, bitumen, covering of underground car parks, covering the ground, we have cracking of clay soils, and then we have cracking of building foundations. And so, there's there's an argument happening in Sydney at the moment where there's massive densification happening. And because one sort of planning policy is saying no car parking on the street, therefore developers want cars, so therefore there's a thing where on the one hand there's no parking on the street, and on the other side there has to be X amount of landscape. So what they're doing is doing underground car parks, putting podium slabs on top of this, and then they're putting landscape on top of the slab. But what's happening there is that landscape is not functioning as landscape. It's functioning as amenity, mitigation of privacy issues, etc. But there's no recharge of aquifers occurring. So there's no contribution that fake landscape makes to the real natural systems, geomorphological situations, geomorphological engineering. And so this relationship between what they're calling in Sydney deep soil is a really important thing, particularly, as I say, in clay soils. And so the ground is important. And so even though it might be artificial, you can't really believe that the artificial is doing the same as what deep soil is doing. So the final section we'll talk about here is what I'm calling ground as geomorphological process. And so I generally try not to have unbuilt projects, but I'm including a range of projects here that are from a couple of student dissertations, as well as some built projects, because I think this is an area that is opening up where the unbuilt is currently ahead of the built, essentially. And so this is this guy Seth Denizon's project. And so he's done this thing that he calls an urban soil taxonomy of the Anthropocene. What's the Anthropocene? Anyone know this term? Sorry? Yeah, that's right. Humans are a geological force. And so this is still a contested term. For instance, geologists find this a very contested term because geology is like turning down the speed of a record. Sorry, bad metaphor for the millennials, but it's really slow. And so geologists, for example, don't believe in human-induced climate change because in geological time there's been so much climate change that they don't regard the climate ever as being stable. And so they say we can't really talk about human-induced climate change because if we just look at the geological record, there's always climate change. And so they don't like this term, apart from the ones that created it, because they say that in geomorphological terms, the humans haven't changed much of the planet at all because rock is heavy, right? You can't mess with rock very much. But in terms of the actual sense of the impact of people on the planet, it's undeniable, because if you just look at raw coverage of the planet, it's massive. And so what Seth was doing here is, in a way, once you open up the idea of the Anthropocene, what you're opening up is the idea that humans and the environment are totally intertwined now. You can't separate off the human from the natural anymore. And so, because even spaces that are natural are being allowed to be natural. They would still, if people could still get in there and make money out of them, they would. It's only that there is policy that's saying, you can't go there. And so the natural is only the natural because we let it be the natural. And what's more, even those places that are natural are experiencing such species depletion that the places that being untouched is no longer enough. And so that we know in the last 10 years that the number of species in the world has declined by, I don't know, I was reading a figure the other day, it's enormous. I don't know if it's 90%, but it's something like that. Australia has massive tracts of national park, and it regarded those tracts as being the way of preserving things. There's one national park outside of Sydney which joins, called the Greater Blue Mountains, and it joins up with a whole lot of other pieces, and it's so big that I know one guy who tried to walk through it, and he walked for 3 months without crossing a road. And he walked with no tracks, and he was just bashing his way through. And so it's massive, but even inside the middle of those places where people get in by helicopter, where they don't even know if anybody has recently been there in the last 200 years, they're still finding species depletion in those places, massive species depletion. So leaving it alone is not enough. So Denizon is taking an interesting position, which is saying that previously what he calls the US, what is it called? Is it the US... what's the name of the soil map? Is it the USDA or the US? It's a soil mapping system that the US has. And all of the soils in the US are still classified according to a natural idea about soil, which is, and it's still the same here, we're basically classing soils on the basis of, the Malmesbury Shale, the such and such and the such and such. And he's saying, well, if so much of the surface is modified, we need to have a new approximation, which he's calling the eighth approximation, to describe these novel soils that are emerging now, which never previously existed before. And so, for example, he's saying, he's got this thing that he calls the Rockefeller. Is it the Rockefeller series or the Eisenhower series? And what he's looking at is he's really saying that how do we describe the soil under a road? We can't describe it as natural anymore because the soil profile is so modified. And so what he's been doing is he really did a project where he tried to map out and find a way of representing all of the different layers of soil as if those soils were a natural formation. So he's utilizing a natural mapping method to map the unnatural, effectively, and saying, this is what's happened. And, obviously he's playing around with AutoCAD, and he's playing around with how it's being represented, and, all of this kind of stuff. And so it's really provocative, but I think it does deal with the basic fact that that soil is now radically different. If you ever work as a gardener on an urban site, on an urban garden, I don't know whether they have the same thing happen here, but in Australia we have these what I called as a gardener water repellent soils, where there's no organic matter left in them. The fines inside them are just variants of sand, and you could pour a glass of water on them and it will just roll up into a ball and it'll roll off the surface. And it's because those soils, all of the organic material that was in them, because the way that soil is held together is via what's known as kind of cation exchange capacity, where the electrical charge that's tied to soil molecules that are related to clays and silts, etc., the water molecules bond with those, and that's how the soil gets held together. And so if there's no organic matter and there's no clay in the soil, you can never re-wet that soil again. And so you have to do processes, which I was doing with some of my clients, of taking years to rebuild a soil by adding small bits of organic matter and watering that little bit and getting that little bit so water will stay in there, and then pushing your way out until you can make a soil that you can grow something with. Because if you start to just dig a hole and put in more soil, you're creating a problem somewhere else. So, these are the kind of conditions we're facing. So I bring that one just to say, soil is changing. If we're talking about the figured ground, then the ground is fundamentally a geomorphological process. It's just over time, it's changed. On the one hand, you have erosion processes that are relatively fast, but when you get down to plate tectonic processes, which have been happening all over the place and are still happening, the time interval is millions of years. But you shouldn't see them as being separate on the continuum. And the idea of the Anthropocene is a way of saying, let's get real about the fact of the change that's occurring, and let's treat it with some level of seriousness. And also, maybe humour, maybe recognising that, that now that the genie is out of the bottle, there's not a lot we can do about it. I don't know if people have heard about these geoengineering. Have people heard of geoengineering? Geoengineering is something that the weapons industry has moved into since nuclear is no longer making money for them. And so basically what they're saying is, let's do things like, let's seed the atmosphere with particulates of silver so that we reflect light back into space so it never touches the ground, so that we can reduce the temperature and reverse global warming. Let's seed the oceans with things that will cause breakdowns and changes of calcium structures to do X, Y, and Z. And so the same technology that was being utilised to describe the greenhouse effect and these things is now being looked at to engineer the climate. But once you do that, you can never go back. Once you take hold of the world, and so the same muscularity that built, and the same scientists that built the nuclear bomb are now looking at how they can sell back to industry ways of modifying the planetary climate. Who's the biggest person looking at it? China. Now, if China's looking at it, it's going to happen. And so this is where we have to understand that the world and its systems are in a kind of flux. Now, it's a very Tanya Kachner kind of conversation. So this is where this project here is an interesting project because it would move away a little bit because this is a project called the Bordeaux Botanic Gardens by Catherine Mosbach and Mosbach Paysagistes, and it's one of the projects that I talked about in my PhD because it really looks at trying to sequence change. And so in particular, the part that I'm going to talk about here is this thing that's called, there's two parts. There's one part called the Environment Gallery and another part called the Field of Crops. And the Botanic Garden was essentially like a representation of the cultural and natural systems of the Aquitaine region. And so this here looks, and it's all process-based, and so this section here, the Field of Crops, utilises flooding techniques back in the old days of panorama stitching. This here looks at flooding using reservoirs, which is the main way that agriculture traditionally has happened in that region. So it's sort of like water collects and then is flooded through channels to irrigate crops. And then the other part is a series of I've called them mounds, which are representations of different types of landscape of the region. And so each one of these is a soil profile from a different part of the Aquitaine region. And so, for example, each of them utilises the soil and representing the soil profile that occurs in the region, as well as has plants on the top of it that are from the region. And what I found interesting, and the reason it's kind of a sort of slightly rhetorical thing about why I included them in my PhD, but my PhD was essentially about growth and the idea that landscape architecture was about growth and change. And it was easy to talk about growth and change in relationship to the organic plants, but how do you talk about growth and change in relationship to the inorganic? And so I said, let's look at projects that utilised erosion as a design process, that sequenced erosion. And so here, these were built by soil contractors who were working in the region, collecting soil from roads. And so as they were excavating to put a road in, Catherine had said, please guys, can you separate off all of the different soil layers? And so they'd get, X many cubic metres of the topsoil, X many cubic metres of the subsoil, of the second layer of subsoil. And then they came back and they relayed those soil profiles in miniature on the site. And what I was interested in was something that was a bit accidental, which was that essentially they were eroding. And so if we look at, and the res is not particularly good at, but if you look at that, that's the topsoil from here being deposited at the bottom of this. And so essentially this is a little miniature catchment. The rain falls on it, the soil moves down, etc. The edges of here were stabilised by bits of fencing, bits of cement mixed with sand. And I became really interested in this idea of what about if you design something to erode and you design the soil mix so that you can say how fast it will erode will depend on how much cement is stabilising it, how the water runs over it, and all of those kind of processes as a design measure of time. And so this is a miniature, it's a representation, and I wasn't interested in it as a representation. I was interested in it as sequencing geomorphological change and working with erosion processes. And so, for example, if we have, in a way, by keeping this material here as a kind of gravel, this mound could keep eroding and keep moving. And the plants that are on the top here will move onto this surface as it erodes and changes over time. And so this is actually a process of sequencing its own self-destruction. And these paths are actually like a contingency. This path might get covered by this one eroding over here, but then you'll still have another path that goes round it. And so the circulation system allows you to move between. Now, we've also had, this is something that Stu Kelly, one of our graduates, worked on a few years ago in his thesis, where he looked at the idea of designing the soil profile to design the vegetation on the surface. So rather than working where we say what needs to grow here, he was looking at totally modifying the ground section and then working with different sorts of soil structure to try to encourage different sorts of things to grow on the surface. So saying, I'm not going to necessarily work with planting I'm going to work with soil and see what happens. Now, there's a difference that I want to draw between this project, which utilizes erosion processes to create form, versus this project, which is another beautiful project, but operates in a different way. This is by Vogt Landscape Architects. Now, these guys are one of the most interesting landscape architects around in the world, and you know, landscape has its own fashions, the same as architecture, and so you could definitely say these are some of the big names in the world, and they do all of the landscape work for Herzog and de Meuron, and their practice used to be called Kinastvogt. It's a particular tradition, very interesting work. And so they were working in this Novartis campus in Basel, which is a sort of pharmaceutical company, and they have this amazing campus, which I've tried 5 times to get into. And the last time I said, I'm here to visit the landscape architecture here, they said, have you got a contact of somebody who can let you in? And I said, no, who should I talk to? And they said, if you haven't got a contact, you can't come in. And I said, but how can I get a contact if I can't talk to anybody? And they said, quite. And I was like, okay, this is like a labyrinth. I can never enter this place. You know, I'll have to sort of accost somebody leaving before I can get in. But this is, you know, what they were trying to do in this project is that they were really trying to sort of create a kind of fake topography and a kind of fake landscape. And it's a bit Halprin-esque insofar as it wasn't based around a particular natural landscape. It was more looking at lessons to be learnt from natural landscapes and then utilising these to make sort of landscape features. And their construction technique was a sort of combination of rammed earth. And so, you know, so they say we are geomorphologic agents. And so utilising a kind of rammed earth framework, and then after that rusticating the surface by hand. And you can see how they're creating these sort of artificial geomorphological strata in the landscape. And then, you know, over time you can also, not over time, but you can see the way that they were working with those different sorts of layers and topography behind each other in this sort of series of walls and mounds. Now, for me, this is the opposite of the stick in the sand approach. This is where you're creating something that replicates something that looks like it was created through a geomorphological process. Whereas this process here, at least, it definitely is starting in that way, but is based around the idea of it transforming into something else. On the other hand, this is like a fake of a natural landscape. Now, finally, I'll end with this project by Sarah Thomas. Is her dissertation. It's not that I'm always going to include dissertations, but I think it's useful for this. Obviously, this is one of the great things about having students is that students, can look at things that don't get looked at in practice, and I encourage people in their dissertations to think this sort of way. So, Sarah, in her project, was working with the Hego Vale, the Hego Quarry, and one of the key things out of this was that obviously this Hego Quarry was quarried quite a long time ago, a lot of the stone of which ended up in Rhodes Memorial. And on the one hand, initially she was starting to work on a kind of sort of leaving it intact, but ultimately she tried to work with a quarrying kind of process and looked at how to build a park by continuing a quarry. And so getting it operating as a quarry again, cutting out material to create platforms and utilising the structure of the infrastructure for trucks and excavators as a way of building the park. So essentially the money for the park gets made through the process of quarrying, etc. So for me, this one is more similar to this one because it's actually utilising a process to make the landscape, albeit it's utilising the synthetic human process of quarrying to do so. So finally, just to sort of recap, the topographic archetype is an example where the figure of the ground itself is something that is made in such a way that it references a natural type of landscape. It's a figure. You can see it. It's a valley. It's a waterfall. It's a mound, or it's a dune. The topological, nothing to do with surface as ground as something geomorphological, instead to do with description of surface. It could be describing origami. You could be talking about folding paper. It just is almost incidental that it ends up being landscape, and it's very tied to the digital. Figured ground, where the manipulation of topography is utilised in the service of program, and where the manipulation of surface is not about featuring the figure, but about figuring activity and figuring the way that the site will be used in sort of purpose of landscape. Artificial ground, total fakery, imagining faking a surface but has none of the geomorphological depth that allows that to become an active part of the natural system. In contrast to ground as geomorphological system, the ground as a system that is the ground as process, which ultimately is what the ground is. The ground is a process that's made up of a tension between geomorphological process measured in millions of years, erosive processes that are probably measured in hundreds of thousands, down to thousands, down to tens of years, human processes that are measured in tens of years, even up to single sorts of years. And so, yeah, that's the lecture. And